Na dun kasung tron an agua de oitoicha han tun han tuam tuamo the ni. Scenario Baha Fan is scenario Baha Fan. On my son's 8th birthday, my mother swapped out his insulin for a bottle of brown capsules she'd ordered from some online group. And when I found him on the kitchen floor that night, she was in the next room watching television. She didn't call 911. She said he just needed to sleep it off. My name is Findralin, and what happened that November changed everything I thought I knew about love, family, and what people are capable of when they believe they're right. Before I go any further, if you're watching this, I want you to know why I'm telling it. Not for sympathy, not to burn anyone down, but because what happened to my son almost happened without anyone knowing why. Drop a comment below if you're here with me. Tell me where you're watching from. I read everyone. Now let me tell you everything. My son Miles was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 2 weeks after his 6th birthday. The pancreas just stops. No warning. No fix. You manage it for the rest of your life. Insulin isn't optional the way some people think medication is optional. Without it, blood sugar spikes, then crashes, then the body starts shutting down. The doctors told us this in clear, direct language. I wrote it down. I kept a notebook. His mother and I had split up the year before, amicably enough. Two people who were better friends than partners. She moved to Portland. Miles lived with me in Knoxville in a 2-bedroom house that smelled like pancakes on weekends and whatever crayon color he'd been obsessing over that week. He was a red-headed, freckled kid who thought everything was funnier than it probably was, and I was completely unprepared to be the kind of parent a child like that deserved. I was figuring it out in real time. My mother, Barbara, came to stay with us the week before Thanksgiving. She'd driven up from Chattanooga with a trunk full of food she prepared herself and an energy I hadn't seen from her in years. She was 63, recently retired, and had become deeply involved in a Facebook group called Natural Restoration Living. She talked about it the way some people talk about church, reverently, like she'd finally found the people who understood the real truth. I hadn't taken it seriously. I should have. She'd mentioned the group before during phone calls, mostly in passing. Something about the medical industry being built on profit, not healing. How the body knows how to fix itself if you stop poisoning it with synthetic chemicals. I'd nod and redirect. She was my mother. She'd raised me largely on our own after my father left when I was 11. I gave her the benefit of the doubt the way you do with someone who has earned it, but there were signs I filed away and ignored. In September, she'd sent Miles a package with a pamphlet inside about children with autoimmune conditions being over-medicated. I read the first paragraph and threw it out. In October, she called and asked whether I'd ever looked into chromium supplementation as an alternative to insulin. I told her firmly that Miles's condition wasn't up for discussion. She'd gone quiet in a way that wasn't agreement. It was the quiet of someone who has already made up their mind. When she arrived for Thanksgiving, she brought Miles a birthday gift. His birthday was November 22nd, 4 days before the holiday. She'd wrapped it in blue paper with a bow and set it on the counter, and Miles had vibrated with excitement for 2 days before we let him open it. It was a remote control car with thick rubber wheels and lights on the hood. He lost his mind. He ran laps around the living room making engine sounds with his mouth, and my mother watched him with this expression I can only describe as tender and certain at the same time. I should have paid more attention to the certain part. The birthday itself was small, just the 3 of us and my neighbor Joel's family from 2 doors down. Joel's daughter Becca was Miles's best friend at school, and the 2 of them terrorized the backyard with the RC car until it got too cold and we brought everyone inside for cake. My mother baked it herself. Yellow cake with chocolate frosting. And she made a point of telling me she'd checked every ingredient for hidden sugars. I thanked her. I meant it. I thought maybe I'd been unfair in my suspicion. That night after everyone left, I did Miles's bedtime insulin check, logged his numbers in the app on my phone, drew the dose from the pen in the refrigerator, and administered it the way I had every single night for 2 years. He was asleep before I finished tucking him in. I went to bed around 11. At 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I can't fully describe. Not a scream. More like a whimper that kept going and going and going without pause. I was down the hall before I was fully awake. Miles was on the floor beside his bed. His body was rigid. His eyes were half open and unseeing. His lips were dry. When I grabbed his arm, his skin was cold and clammy, and he didn't respond to his name. I called 911. My hands were shaking so badly I dialed wrong twice. When I finally got through, I told them my son was a type 1 diabetic and I thought he was in hypoglycemic shock. They told me not to move him. I sat on the floor next to him and held his hand and talked to him until they heard the sirens. My mother appeared in the doorway. She was wearing her robe. Her hands were folded at her waist. "He'll be okay," she said. "His body is just adjusting." I looked at her. "Adjusting to what?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. And in that pause, something in me went very, very cold. The paramedics were there in 6 minutes. They checked his blood glucose level on the spot, 28 mg/dl. Normal for Miles was between 80 and 120. At 28, organs start to fail. At 28, children don't always come back. They stabilized him in the ambulance with dextrose and got him to University of Tennessee Medical Center in under 12 minutes. By the time I arrived in the waiting room, they had him on a drip and a monitor and were telling me it had been close. Very close. I sat in that waiting room for 2 hours while they monitored him. I called his mother in Portland. Her voice on the phone was the sound of controlled terror, which is a very specific sound, and I had to talk her down from getting in a car and driving through the night. I told her I'd update her every hour. I told her he was stable. What I didn't tell her yet was what I'd found before I left the house. When the paramedics arrived, my mother had gone back to her room. I had about 90 seconds between her leaving and the paramedics coming upstairs. Something made me go to the refrigerator. Not logic. Something older than logic. The insulin pen was in the door compartment where I always kept it, but when I picked it up, I felt immediately that something was off. The weight. The slight resistance of the cartridge inside. I uncapped it, looked at the cartridge, and saw that the liquid was slightly darker than it should be. Not much. Just a shade. I took it with me to the hospital. The doctor who examined it the next morning called me into a small room and closed the door. He set the pen on the table between us and said, "This isn't insulin." Then he put a small amber-colored capsule beside it. "Same substance. This is a botanical compound, mainly cinnamon bark extract and bitter melon." He told me neither substance is harmful in small doses for healthy adults, but for a type 1 diabetic child, replacing insulin with something that has no clinical efficacy for blood glucose regulation is the same as giving them nothing at all. He asked me if I knew how it had gotten in the pen. I told him I had a theory. He told me I needed to call the police. I went back to the house that afternoon with Miles still in the hospital and my mother still there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a book open in front of her. She looked up when I came in. She asked how he was. "Better," I said. "No thanks to that pen." She put the book down. Her expression didn't change much, just a slight tightening around the eyes. I set my phone on the table. I had recorded the morning's conversation with the doctor. I pressed play. She listened without interrupting. When it ended, I asked her directly, "Did you replace his insulin?" She folded her hands the same way she had in the doorway at 3 in the morning. She said, "I replaced the synthetic version with something the body can actually use." I stared at her. She said, "Finn, I watched your grandfather die because of insulin dependency. His kidneys failed. His circulation failed. He spent the last 4 years of his life in and out of hospitals, and he was miserable. I am not going to watch that happen to Miles." I said, "Miles's blood sugar was 28. He was on the floor. Do you understand what that means?" She said, "His body was adjusting. Sometimes it has to get worse before it gets better." That's what Dr. Henshaw says in the group. I asked who Dr. Henshaw was. She slid her phone across the table. On the screen was a Facebook group post, Natural Restoration Living. 4,000 members. The pinned post was written by someone called Dr. Roy Henshaw, ND, and it was titled, "Why Insulin Dependency is a Choice, Not a Necessity." 1,200 likes. I read 2 paragraphs. My vision went tight around the edges. The post said type 1 diabetes in children was largely a diagnosis of convenience for pharmaceutical companies, that botanical protocols had shown significant promise in reducing or eliminating insulin requirements, and that parents who were willing to commit to the protocol had seen their children thrive without synthetic intervention. Below the post, in the comments, was my mother's account. She had commented 6 times in the last 3 months. The most recent comment, posted 2 weeks ago, said, "My grandson is 8 type 1, currently on 2 daily injections. I'm visiting for his birthday and I'm going to try the switch. Will update." The comment had 17 replies. 14 of them said things like, "So brave," and "Trust the protocol." Two of them expressed concern. One of them said, "Please don't do this. My daughter almost died." My mother had not responded to that one. I took a screenshot of everything. I stood up, picked up my phone, and walked to the back porch. My mother called after me. "Finn, please listen to me. I know you're scared, but I did this because I love him." I stood outside in the cold for a long time. The yard was still scattered with birthday decorations. The blue and silver streamers had gone limp overnight. The RC car was parked by the steps where Miles had left it, and looking at it made my chest feel like something was collapsing inside it. I called Detective Sarah Okonkwo. She'd been recommended to me by Miles as pediatrician, who I'd already called on the way home, and who had told me in a voice that left no room for interpretation, "Finn, this is a crime." I told Detective Okonkwo everything. She asked me to stay at the house and not remove anything. I went back inside. My mother was still at the kitchen table. I sat down across from her, and I looked at her face. The same face that had sat with me through fevers and bad grades, and the worst night of my life when I was 19 and got a call that my best friend had been in an accident. The face I'd trusted completely for 31 years. She looked back at me. She didn't look guilty. She looked certain. That was the part that undid me. Detective Okonkwo arrived within the hour with a partner. She was measured and quiet, the kind of calm that makes a room feel smaller. She took my statement at the kitchen table while her partner bagged the insulin pen, the bottle of capsules she found in my mother's suitcase, and the printout of the Facebook post I'd screenshotted and printed. She asked my mother a series of questions in a tone that gave nothing away. My mother answered in full sentences, without hesitation, explaining her reasoning as if she were describing a recipe. At one point, Detective Okonkwo asked, "Were you aware that replacing prescribed insulin in a type 1 diabetic child could result in a life-threatening hypoglycemic episode?" My mother said, "I was aware that the adjustment period could be uncomfortable. I was not going to stand by and watch him be poisoned slowly." Okonkwo wrote something down without reacting. After the detective left, she told me she'd be in touch within 24 hours. My mother went to the guest room. I drove back to the hospital and sat beside Miles's bed and watched him sleep until visiting hours ended. His mother flew in from Portland the next morning. She walked into the hospital room and went straight to Miles and didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were red and her voice was quiet. She said, "How did this happen?" I told her everything. She sat down and listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at her hands. She said, "I want her charged." I said, "So do I." The charges came down 2 weeks later. Reckless endangerment of a minor, tampering with prescription medication. The DA added a third count after Detective Okonkwo pulled my mother's private messages in the Facebook group and found detailed instructions she had shared with 3 other members about how to perform the switch without the parents' knowledge. One of those members had a daughter with type 1. Another had a nephew with an insulin pump. The messages went back 8 months. My mother had been planning this before she bought that birthday gift. I found that out on a Tuesday afternoon, and I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for a very long time. I thought about every phone call in the last year, every question she'd asked about Miles's medication schedule, every time she'd visited and offered to help with bedtime. I thought she was just being attentive, just being a grandmother. Her attorney argued at arraignment that she was acting out of genuine concern for her grandchild and had no malicious intent. The judge set bail and scheduled a trial date. My mother called me from her sister's house in Chattanooga that night. She said she was sorry for scaring me. She said she was not sorry for trying. I didn't call her back. The trial was held in Knox County the following February. The courtroom smelled the way courtrooms do, like old paper and recycled air. Miles's mother sat beside me. Joel was there. Miles's pediatrician took the stand and explained in plain language what a blood glucose of 28 does to a child's body and what it would have done if I hadn't woken up. The prosecution presented the Facebook messages, 12 pages printed and entered as evidence. My mother's comments, her private messages, a post she'd written 3 months before the birthday that said, "Phase 1 is building trust. Phase 2 is the switch. Phase 3 is watching them thrive." It had gotten 44 likes from group members. Detective Okonkwo testified that during her investigation, she had identified 2 other families in the Facebook group whose children had been subjected to unauthorized medication switches by grandparents following the group's protocol. Neither family had pressed charges. One child had been hospitalized. One had not, but only because the insulin pump had an alarm that alerted the parents before levels dropped too far. My mother's attorney tried to argue incompetence rather than malice, a genuine misunderstanding of the medical stakes. He brought in a naturopath who testified that botanical compounds had shown efficacy in managing type 2 diabetes in some studies. The prosecutor dismantled this in under 3 minutes by pointing out that Miles had type 1 diabetes, that type 1 and type 2 are fundamentally different conditions, and that the naturopath had never treated a child with either. Then my mother took the stand. She answered her attorney's questions calmly, the same certainty in her voice that had always been there. She talked about my grandfather, how he'd spent his last years on dialysis, how she'd watched him deteriorate and felt completely helpless, how when Miles was diagnosed, something in her had locked onto the idea that she could stop history from repeating. Her voice broke only once, when she said, "I just didn't want to lose him like I lost my father." It was the first moment I understood what had been driving her. Not arrogance alone, fear. The specific fear of someone who has already watched the worst happen and will do anything not to watch it again. It didn't excuse what she did, but it explained it, and somehow that was harder than anger. The prosecutor stood up and said, quietly, "Mrs. Baez, Alderman, did you tell your son what you were doing?" She said no. He said, "Did you tell Miles's doctors?" She said no. He said, "Did you ask anyone with a medical degree whether this plan was safe?" She said, "Dr. Henshaw has a doctorate in naturopathy." He said, "Dr. Henshaw has a doctorate in naturopathy." He said, "Dr. Henshaw has a doctorate in naturopathy." Henshaw has never treated a patient in a clinical setting. He runs a subscription newsletter and charges $400 for a protocol kit. He is currently under investigation by the FTC for fraudulent health claims. The courtroom went quiet. My mother looked down at her hands. The certainty drained out of her face for the first time since this had started. What was left looked a lot like someone finally seeing the room they'd been standing in. When it was my turn to testify, I kept it short. I told them what I found when I went to the refrigerator at 3 a.m. I told them what Miles's blood sugar had been. I told them what the paramedic's face had looked like when he checked the number. I looked at my mother before I stepped down. I said, "You taught me that love means showing up. You were there that night, and you didn't call 911. She closed her eyes. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in state prison, reduced to 2 with good behavior, plus mandatory supervised contact restrictions with Miles until he turned 18. The Dr. Henshaw network was referred to the FTC and the state medical board. 3 other group members were under investigation by their county DAs. She was escorted out of the courtroom without looking back. Outside on the courthouse steps, the February air was sharp and cold, and the sky was the specific pale gray of winter in Tennessee. Miles's mother stood next to me, not saying anything. After a long moment, she said, "Is it okay that I feel sad about this?" I said, "Yes. I feel sad about it too." We stood there for another minute. Then we went to pick up our son. 6 months later, spring came to Knoxville the way it always does. Suddenly and all at once, like it remembered it was supposed to be there. Miles turned 9 in a yard full of his school friends and a cake his mother had flown in to bake from scratch. He wore a continuous glucose monitor now, a small sensor on his arm that sent readings to my phone every 5 minutes. He'd named it R2. He told his friends it made him a cyborg. He wasn't wrong. He didn't ask about his grandmother much. Once, in the fall, he asked why she wasn't coming to Thanksgiving. I told him she made a decision that hurt him, and she needed some time to think about it. He nodded the way 8-year-olds do when they understand more than you think they do, and then he asked if we could get pizza for dinner. We got pizza. His mother had moved back to Knoxville by January. Not for me, for him. We weren't going to be something we weren't, but we were good at being in the same room, and Miles deserved 2 parents in the same city. We ate dinner together twice a week. We argued about whose turn it was to refill his glucose supplies and whose playlist was playing in the car. It was ordinary and imperfect, and I was grateful for every unremarkable minute of it. My mother's sister called me once a month. She'd relay small updates that Barbara was in a program, that she'd been removed from the Facebook group and had agreed, finally, to meet with a licensed therapist who specialized in health-related anxiety. That she'd written me a letter she wasn't sure she should send. I told her to hold on to the letter for now. I wasn't ready. Maybe someday I would be. Maybe someday the word mother would stop splitting down the middle when I said it. But I wasn't going to force that timeline. I'd learned something in the last year about waiting for the right conditions before you trust something to hold. One evening in May, I was sitting on the back porch after Miles had gone to bed. The yard was dark except for the string lights along the fence, and I had my phone in my hand with his glucose reading open on the screen. 94 milligrams/DL. Perfect. The number that used to feel like a small miracle every time I saw it had started, slowly, to feel like just a number. A normal number. The kind I was supposed to see. I thought about my mother on her kitchen floor explaining her father's last years. I thought about the Facebook group with its 4,000 members and its certainty. I thought about Dr. Roy Henshaw and his protocol kit and all the scared people who'd bought it because they needed something to believe in more than they needed it to be true. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who has carried something heavy a long way and finally set it down. I looked at Miles's number on the screen. 94. Still perfect. I put the phone in my pocket and went inside. There's a version of love that comes from fear, and I understand it better than I want to. The desperate need to prevent the thing you're most afraid of. The way that need can override everything else, including logic, including consent, including the simple act of asking before you act. I felt it myself in the 3 seconds between touching that pen and understanding what was wrong with it. That animal certainty that you will do anything, to keep this child alive. The difference is what you do next. You can let that fear make you reckless, or you can let it make you careful. And the careful version, the one that checks with doctors and reads the literature and asks the people who actually know, that version is harder. It doesn't feel as powerful. It doesn't give you the sense that you're doing something. But it's the version that keeps your son's blood sugar at 94 on a Tuesday night in May and lets him wake up the next morning and complain about having to brush his teeth. That's the whole thing, right there. If this story reached you in some way, I want to hear about it. Maybe you've been in a room with someone you love and realized you couldn't trust what they were telling you about what they were doing. Maybe you've been the person who thought they knew better. I don't think this story belongs to me alone. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're thinking. And if you want more stories like this one about the hard things that happen inside families and the even harder things that happen after, subscribe to the channel. Every person who stays is someone I get to keep telling the truth to. That means more than I know how to say. I've spent a lot of time since that November thinking about what makes a person do what my mother did. Not to torture myself, just to understand it well enough that I stop being blindsided by it. Here's what I keep coming back to. She wasn't wrong that she loved Miles. She did. That was never the question. The question was whether love is enough on its own, without honesty, without consent, without the humility to say I don't actually know more than the people who have studied this for 30 years. And the answer, the one I learned at 3 a.m. on a kitchen floor in Knoxville, is that love without those things isn't just insufficient. It's dangerous. My mother acted from fear. I understand that now, in a way I couldn't, in the weeks right after it happened, when I was still too raw to hold anything but anger. She'd watched her father deteriorate. She'd felt helpless. And then Miles was diagnosed, and that helplessness came roaring back. And she found a group of people online who handed her a story that made her feel like she could do something. That's a powerful thing to offer a scared person. The group didn't need to convince her of much. She was already halfway there. What she lacked wasn't love. It was the courage to sit with uncertainty instead of filling it with something that felt like action. That's the harder version of caring for someone, not doing everything you can think of. Doing the right thing, even when the right thing is slower and less satisfying and doesn't make you feel powerful. Miles is 9 now. He calls his glucose monitor R2. His numbers are good. He complains about brushing his teeth and argues about which shows he's allowed to watch on school nights, and every single one of those arguments is something I am deeply, embarrassingly grateful for. I think about what I want to teach him from all of this, not in a speech, but in the way I actually live. I want him to see that when you don't know something, you say so, and then you go find out. That asking for help isn't weakness, that the people who are most certain are sometimes the most wrong, and that the hardest kind of intelligence isn't knowing things. It's knowing the limits of what you know. I want him to see that when something breaks, you don't pretend it isn't broken. My mother spent 8 months pretending inside a Facebook group that she had answers she didn't have. The consequences of that landed on a child who had done nothing except exist with a condition he didn't choose. That's the thing about choosing not to face the truth. Someone else always pays for it eventually. And I want him to see that you can survive the worst thing your family does to you and still be okay. Not because you forget it or forgive it on a timeline someone else sets for you, but because you decide that the worst thing that happened to you is not the most important thing about your life. Miles' story isn't the night his grandmother put him in the hospital. His story is the RC car and the glucose monitor named R2 and the drawing he made last spring of the two of us fishing at the lake behind the house. That's the story. The rest of it is just something that happened on the way there. I still have her letter, the one her sister has been holding. I'll read it someday. Maybe not soon, but someday. Because holding on to the weight of it doesn't protect Miles, and it doesn't protect me. It just makes everything heavier. What I know for certain is this: the right choice in any moment isn't always the one that feels most like love. Sometimes it's the quiet one. The one that asks first. The one that picks up the phone at 3 a.m. instead of standing in a doorway saying he'll be fine. Strength isn't volume. It isn't certainty. It's the willingness to do the hard, careful thing when everything in you wants to do something faster. Miles showed me that. He showed me what it looks like to carry something difficult and still wake up the next morning and ask what's for breakfast. I'm still learning from my kid. I think that's probably how it's supposed to go.